Right, good morning, everybody. Can I have everyone's attention, please? Good morning, sorry for the delay. The solution to my projector problem seems to be to turn my computer off and back on. I apologize that it took me so long to get to that conclusion. So, good morning. Today we are going to learn React.js. Many of you have been looking forward to this day. Some of you don't care. But it's an exciting day because yesterday you used vanilla built-in handlers or functions and methods to take some data from the backend. So we send an AJAX request to get to the backend, get some data. Once we got that data, we used our methods that we get from the document object to interact with the DOM and change the page, change what our user's seeing manually. So, did y'all feel like you knew exactly what was going on when you were doing that? How many of you felt like this is less structured than the tools we've used in the past? Yeah, some who's like, where do I even go from here? For an app as small as Trip Planner, really, you don't need any more tools than what you were using. But what we want to transition to today is actually step away from manually changing the DOM. Because we don't, let's say that we have a large application and we are like, okay, I'm gonna put some, hotels here, and when the user adds a hotel, I'm gonna do all these things. Let's say someone comes into that project and they have no idea where anything is supposed to go. There's no given structure. It's also a very expensive operation to modify the DOM. And we may not be doing it in the most efficient way. So this is where front-end frameworks come in. Front-end frameworks give us a way to organize our code so that we can say, here's what I want it to look like. You worry about actually updating the DOM so that it looks the way that I told you. It allows us to program our applications in a more declarative way. So we are declaring, here is how I want my app to act. And the front-end framework is going to take that and say, okay, I will communicate an interface with the DOM itself to make sure that the view is what you have told me it should be. React.js takes care of a part of that process. So it is a library for building user interfaces. It's unlike Angular. Angular is more like a full solution. Angular's like, I'm giving you everything you need for you to build this front-end application, and you have to do it my way. React's much more straightforward, saying, I do just this thing. I take data you give me, I create a view for the user. Anything else you want to do, so state management, plugging into the URL, fetching data from the backend, you need to install another library to do that. And so what we end up with is an ecosystem of libraries that are used with React. But it also gives you a lot of flexibility as the developer on how you want your app to behave, how you want to put it together. And the reason that this comes up, like we learned yesterday in Trip Planner, is that making a user interface is hard. We have to remember so many things. There are so many events that are happening. We need to make sure that we're listening for those events, and we change all the parts of the interface that need to change when those data change. State is one of the hardest things to control and think about inside of any application. We might not feel that way right now because our applications have been tiny. But state is a very hard problem. In your Trip Planner app yesterday, how did you keep track of what your user wanted in their itinerary? Imagine that you all had different solutions for that. You might have kept it in like an HTML attribute. You might have kept it in an object and then just had to make sure that when you were updating that object, you were able to do that in an asynchronous way. You might have just pulled whatever you need from the database every single time. So state's a hard problem. What we want is that if we have some state object, we want to be able to change that state and have that be automatically reflected in the view without us having to do anything. So we have this to-do app. What is the data in this app? What data do I need to keep track of at any given time? You can raise your hand, you can shout it out, but if you shout it out, don't mumble. Kathy. Okay, so we have the task itself, we have the list of tasks or to-dos. What else?
Yeah, whether or not they're completed.
But whether or not they're completed, great. What else? Notice we have a few other things down here.
Is that cute?
What?
Is the thing active or not?
Okay, great. So are we showing all of the to-dos, just the active to-dos, or just the completed to-dos? The text that's written in the input, the number of items on the screen. There's a lot for us to keep track of that's not just the to-dos, right? So our data might look a little bit like this. We have some to-dos, they have text, they have a status, and maybe we want to also keep track of whether or not they are all showing just the completed or just the active ones. So how do we represent this data on our front end in the DOM? Well, we could be a cowboy coder. It's like, well, we'll just force the DOM to look how we want. So if we added to-do, we could push to our to-dos array, right, that's on our front end. We could then append a new element to the DOM. That seems straightforward, super easy, love it. But wait, does the status of the new to-do match the status that is currently showing? It's like, okay, yes, append it. No, okay, don't append it. It's fine. If we don't append it to the DOM, then where do we put it? It might still be in our list, but we're not showing it on the DOM. But then we change our status. We need to check our list of to-dos and add in any that aren't showing back in. Or we could get rid of the whole thing and redo it, but that seems like a waste of effort. So we have more problems popping up now. Like, I just want to change some of the to-dos and not all the to-dos. And I don't really want to have to figure that out. So how we change the view after we change the data can be a hard problem. One possible solution is getting rid of the data. What if we just held the data on the DOM itself in that object? That's not the best idea. So accessing the DOM and manipulating the DOM is expensive. It's computationally expensive. The reason being, the browser was never really meant for Web 2.0 applications. It was meant for brochureware. It was meant for, static sites. You click a link and it goes to another site. The browser is, of course, constantly improving, and so is the DOM. But it just wasn't really meant for these kinds of operations. So these operations are rather expensive. And then if we put all of our data into the DOM, it's no longer portable because it's not data. They're DOM nodes. If we get rid of them, they are gone forever. And it will be very insanely difficult for anyone, including yourself, to figure out what you did later. So what if we could just change the data and then the view would just react? Now we're getting somewhere. So that is the idea behind React. The idea that we only have to control what we want it to look like and how our data is changing, and that will update how the data is viewed. Carol. Great question. It works with Ajax. Ajax we will still need in order to get the data that we're going to be using to then update the view. And we'll go through some examples this afternoon. So React, inside of React, our data is called state. More precisely, the state is the data that changes. When you update your state, React is going to essentially look at that state, see what changed, and update or re-render the view. It's going to try to do this in the most performant way possible, and it does this because by using a virtual DOM. So it has its own representation of the document object model within memory as like JavaScript objects. And so it's almost like it runs a little simulation. It says, based on the data you changed, what do I need to change? And then can go to the DOM and make those changes in a more performant way. So, back to our cowboy coder. Well, we can just change that object whenever we want, however we want. Still wrong. We do not want to directly mutate the state that our React application is pulling from. In fact, we are going to use a method that React gives us called setState. So I have an object, it is my state, and I want to change it with some new data so that my view is updated to reflect that. I'm going to use a setState method, and it says this.setState will actually see what this is in a moment. It is the React component that we're currently in, but we are going to give it the new properties that we want to change, and it is going to merge these two objects and return to us a new state object. And this is so React can intelligently handle multiple updates happening at a time. If we were mutating it directly, and if we were doing this in a few different places in response to like user events, we could end up with a very messed up state object. In fact, if we do mutate it directly, React will not consider that a change and will not re-render our component. So, let's walk through React as if it were a gumball machine. We've got our React thing here. We have some change. The change and the current state of React are going to essentially be merged by setState. You can think of it almost like a reduce function. So we're going to pass some change into setState and get the updated view out. So when you set the state, React updates the view. Okay, so enough of the slides. Because really you just have to see it happen. So let's make a very simple React component. And I'm starting with a completely clear directory here, so you are welcome to go along with me if you'd like. And let's create a couple of things here. We're only going to be creating a front-end application. So let's just have like an index.html. I'm not even going to create a server. Let's go ahead and make this an npm package. So I'm going to run npm init. And now I have a package.json, and I'm going to install a few things. So npm install, I'm going to install React. And I'm also going to install a library called React DOM. So React is separated into these two libraries because React DOM is going to control the actual updating of the DOM itself, and React is going to control taking your state and updating its view accordingly. So they're going to work together. The reason that they are separated is because we also have something you've probably heard of, React Native. React DOM is the web version of React Native. So both of them use the React library. And then there are two different implementations for both native applications on your phone and for the web. Cool. So now in my index.html, just going to create a very simple index.html, and I'm going to create a div in here and give it an ID of root. The name of this ID does not matter. What matters is that I have an ID pointing to where I want my data to eventually live. It's like the buns site from yesterday. We didn't really put the main content in the index.html. We created that with JavaScript. Cool. So I'm just going to create a public folder, which will have my bundle inside. So I'm going to be working solely on the front end, but I still want to be able to use modules, and so I'm going to use Webpack to build everything, all my React code into a single file that I'm going to have inside of public bundle.js. So that means that in here, let's go ahead and put this in here. I have a script tag that is source bundle.js, I believe. Since I don't have a server, let's tell it is in public. Public bundle.js. All right. And I'm also going to put something on it called deferred. Can someone tell me what defer means? Sarah in the back.
It doesn't run until everything else on the page has loaded.
Right, exactly. So this allows me to put my script tag in the head portion of my index.html instead of at the bottom of the body, but it's not actually going to run until these nodes are created and mounted on the DOM and rendered by the renderer. Which is great because my JavaScript probably is going to want to access those elements, and I can't do that unless they're already mounted. All right, I think we've got almost everything we need to begin. Let's create a webpack.config.js, and my package JSON, I'm going to create a build script that's going to run webpack-w, and that also means that I need to install Webpack, and I'm going to put save dev in front of this, which means it's going to install Webpack as a dev dependency instead of a regular dev dependency. This means that Webpack will not be installed if I'm running this app in production. So Webpack and Webpack CLI. Is this on? Okay. Sure. All right. Now, Webpack config files are not something that you need to remember, memorize, anything like that. In fact, I generally have a single config file that I use for almost all my projects, and I just copy and paste it around. So I'm going to go ahead and take a config file from a different project. Like that. And we have, it's going to be taking client index.js, which I need to create. It's putting the output inside of bundle.js. Let's put that inside of public bundle.js. Public bundle.js. I'm giving it a mode of development. I'm just saying, hey, this is where I am in the computer, and I'm also using this dev tool called source maps. This is going to allow me to, when an error is thrown, it's going to allow me to actually see where that error is coming from instead of a line in the bundle. It's like it's mapping parts of the bundle back to the original locations. Okay, and last thing, let's actually create a client.js, or not .js, let's change the name of that. Client folder, and inside of that client folder I'll have an index.js. Let's just put a console log in there, make sure we're getting everything to run appropriately. Go here, save this. And now, yeah, I know. Let's open index.h, or let's run build. So npm run build should run Webpack. And missing script. Let's make sure I'm in the right place. I have my package JSON inside of that. I'm running Webpack. Fine, I'll run it on its own. Webpack -w. Great, so if I look inside of public, I have a bundle. I also have this bundle.js.map. This is being created by my dev tool source maps. Oh, this is not saved. That is why. Let's close it because something else tried to change it. We'll put it back in there in a moment. But it seems like everything is running all right. If I open it up, so I can close this. Let's just open index.html over here. If I open up my console, I see hi. So I have everything up and running. This is really important for React. That's why I wanted to go through it again, because we're going to be adding some stuff to our Webpack config to get React to work properly. Let me just fix my package.json real quick and put the build back. There we go. And now that I've opened my index.html, I'm going to run npm run build, and I'll just have this running so that every time I make a change, it'll rerun Webpack. Cool. Now we're actually ready to start. Inside of my index.js, I want to use React and React DOM. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a component. React divides pieces of our application up into components. This is great because it allows me to say, okay, I have this view that I want. Maybe it's a chat, maybe it's a comment. This is going to be a single component. Now I can reuse this component in multiple places in my application and just pass it different data. So the first thing I'm going to do is import. So import React DOM from React DOM. And now I'm going to say React DOM.render. And now I'm essentially saying I want you to render this component to my DOM. Is exactly what this render is going to do. It takes two arguments. The first is the component I want to render, and the second argument is the element where I want to render. So the first one, I don't really have anything quite yet. Let's say I want to render an H1. So let's just put an H1 in there. H1, hello, H1. That seems like it might work, right? And let's say document.get element by ID, and I'm going to go find root. I'm saying I want to put this H1 into root. Yes?
Doesn't this have to be on line 3, capital D-O-M?
Yep, it does. Thanks for listening to my my linter when I wasn't. All right, I have an error. It says unexpected token. It's talking about this bracket. Is what I did up there proper JavaScript? Can I put HTML in JavaScript like that? No, I can't. What we've been doing is creating a string of JavaScript and then, or a string of HTML and then sending it to the client, and we're sending it as a type of HTML so that the browser can see that and say, I know this is supposed to be HTML, let me render it. But that's not what I'm doing here. So I can't just give it a string. I actually want to give it something that looks like that. But I get a hint down here. It says module parse failed. You may need an appropriate loader to handle this file type. And it is correct. What we need is something called Babel. Babel is a JavaScript compiler, really. Not in the same way that V8 is a JavaScript compiler. It does not compile JavaScript to machine code, but rather generally to other JavaScript. So I can use Babel to transpile my ES6 code to ES5, for example, to make sure that all browsers, even if they're very, very old, I might have users that have outdated browsers, and I want my app to still work on their machines without me having to only write ES5 code. So let's look at an example. Let's make this a little bigger. When I go to try it out, I see some HTML looking stuff, and I see a ES6 arrow function. And I can see how it's going to convert that. Oddly enough, this is exactly what I want to do inside of my application, right? I want to be able to use HTML-like syntax to define my view. If you look over here, what Babel is transpiling it to is something like called React.createElement. So this is being essentially transitioned or transcribed, compiled, whatever you want to call it, into pure JavaScript using the React library. So the React create element function is what we're actually using to create our views. But as you can see, it needs so much information that it's rather clunky. Writing it out ourselves would suck. Because we have to say, okay, what kind of elements is it? I think this is text node or attributes, perhaps. And then the third argument is its children. And depending on how nested our view is, this could get really messy really quickly. So what we do is rewrite it in this HTML-like syntax and have it compile to JavaScript. So in our bundle, it'll look like this. And this is actually what the browser will be running. But when we write it, it'll look like this. This syntax is called JSX, which is essentially like JavaScript, like XML format. So we're going to be using this, but we need to install Babel before we can do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to install Babel, and then we're going to have Webpack run Babel as it compiles. Okay?
In your index.js
Uh-huh.
if you set up React, that you can just write HTML in there.
Yeah. It has some slight differences, like we're not really writing HTML, we're writing JSX. It mostly is the same. I'll be pointing out parts where it's different, but it's mainly like class. The word class, right, is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so we can't use the word class in our JSX. We have to use class name instead, so little things like that. But yeah, we can just put it right in. It's pretty great. So let's do this. I'm going to close out Webpack and install quite a few things. So we need to install Babel. We need to install something called Babel Loader. And we need to install a few different presets as well. So npm install, I'm going to say Babel core, Babel Loader. And then I'm also going to do Babel preset React. So that's what is saying I want to be able to convert JSX to JavaScript. And Babel preset env, which is going to say I want to be able to convert my ES6 and 7 code back to ES5 so that all browsers can run it. Let's say, just make sure that I didn't misspell anything. And now I'm going to go to my Webpack config, and at the bottom here I'm going to add some extra stuff. So I'm going to add a module property. Let me make it a little smaller just so we can look at it all together. So it's module property. I'm essentially saying, hey, I want you to find everything that ends in .js or .jsx. A lot of times if you use .jsx code inside of a JavaScript file, some people will use the extension .jsx just to show you can use either, just be consistent. And it's saying, okay, use Babel Loader for these files. Like run them through Babel first. And now we're also going to create something called .babelrc, and we're going to say what presets we want to run this through. So we have two presets that we created. We say presets. We did env, which is for our ES6 code, and React, which is for our, and don't worry about my linter, it'll actually work. And our React, which is for our JSX. Cool, so I think that's it. Let's just see if it works. So npm run build. seems to have worked. And now in my index.js, this seems to be running fine. If I go to my bundle, I can do a search for react.createElement, and I can see my h1 that I've created in there. So react.createElement, I got my h1, null, hello, etc. Okay. And now in here, refresh. React is not defined. Let's fix that. So we now know that this is going to be converted to react.createElement. That means I need to have the React object that createElement can come from within the scope of this file, so that because this is going to be almost completely replaced by react.createElement. So I can say import React from React. Now refresh, and after much work, I get something on the page. But that's a lot of work for not a whole lot of gain, right? That is why for very small applications, you don't need to use React. But for larger applications, it is a very, very nice tool. So let's make our first component. So we're going to make that hello world. It's going to be component. Actually, we're going to jump straight to our next example, which is going to be a button component. So what I'm going to do, yeah.
What's the difference between React on React, and would you ever just component under? We always prefer to like that.
Good question. This is our main file. This is going to be our index.js. It's going to be the root of our client folder. We only ever want to call react.render once. React.render is going to take the entire kind of built view and put it into the DOM. So we're saying take root, put this in there. But you'll probably have many components that read into whatever you end up putting here. However, the React library you'll probably want in every single file that has a component inside. All right, so I created a button.js, and this is going to be a component. A component is essentially a class that is going to inherit from React's component class. So I know that I need to import React from React, and I know that I'm going to create a class. I'm going to say class, I'll call it button, extends react.component. So this is going to be my new React component. I'm going to give it a constructor. Actually, let's wait for a minute. The one thing that it has to have is a render method. This render method is going to have the JSX that when I say I want to use this component, here is the view. So for this little application, this is our button pressing game. Y'all used it, I think, in the Webpack lecture, where you click it 10 times and you win. Very, very simple, but is actually a really great thing to do here. So I'm just going to put an H1 here and say button game. Close up my H1. One thing about render is you can only actually return one piece of JSX, which means generally we want to return a div with everything inside of it. Okay? So then, need to do this. All right, so we have my button game. I now need the button itself. So let's do a button. It's going to just say click me for now. Click me. And then I need some kind of here are, I guess that's it, right? We just need a button. Click this button so many times, it says. Okay, so button game, and let's say, just put it right in here. Click me 10 times. Super easy button game. Seems unhappy about, there we go. All right, so this is all I really need for my button. So I'm going to export my button, export default my button class. And inside of my index.js, instead of just putting this hello, I'm going to use my button component. So I'm going to import button from button.js. And instead of my h1s, I'm going to use button. So there are a few ways I could do this. I could put in button and invoke it. That would work. But it's a component. It's essentially representing a group of HTML elements. So what I actually want is I'm going to call it like this. I'm saying I want to take the view that is button and I want to put it into my page. Just save this, refresh, and now I have a button game, click me 10 times. But right now, nothing is happening, right? Well, let's make something happen. I need a click handler. First off, though, do I need any state that controls what's controlling my button? Let's say that once I click it 10 times, I want to replace the button instead with a U1 message. In order to do that, what piece of data do I need to keep track of? Yeah, the clicks. So some number of some sort. So I'm going to create some state. And I can do this by creating a constructor. And inside of that constructor, the first thing that I need to do is call super. What does super do when I call it inside of a constructor when I'm using class syntax?
Previous state, like previous list, previous list.
I think you have the right idea, but perhaps the wrong words. But you have the right idea in, like, say, previous. I'm going to let someone else try. Yes?
Is that like we had the example where there was an animal class and there was a dog class? And so super would take all of the properties from animal class and apply it to the dog?
Exactly. It allows us to call the parent constructor, right? So in order to use anything to use the this keyword inside of a constructor, if we're extending from something else, we need to call super. We're saying when I create this button, I need to first call the constructor of React.component. So now once I'm done with that, I can say this.state is equal to some object, and I can put whatever I want in here. So I'm going to say clicks, and I'm going to instantiate it to 0. You're going to be hearing some words, some laws thrown around, Tom's laws. Tom's first law is that we always instantiate our state to the same type that we are expecting it to be. So I want clicks to be a number, therefore I'm starting it at 0. There should always be a default state. All right, so now when it clicks, I need to update that. So I'm going to create a function, and I can call it whatever I want, but you'll often see it called click handler. And I want this click handler to run when I click that button. The way that I can do that is on my button, I can give it an onClick attribute. And then I want that onClick attribute to be equal to this function. So I'm saying when I click, run this function. Now, inside of a JSX expression, I can't use JavaScript just on its own because then it will be interpreted as text inside of my elements, right? It will end up on my page. So I need to interpolate JavaScript expressions instead. And it's very, very, very similar to your template literal strings. Like inside of a template literal string with your backticks, we have to use the $sign squiggly brackets, right? This is the same thing, but there's no $sign, just the squiggly brackets. So if you want to run JavaScript, which means also just if you want to access a variable, run JavaScript, evaluate some JavaScript expression, we need to use the squiggly brackets. But once I have that, I can now say I want to run my click handler when I click this button. So this is a class, this entire thing is a class, and so to get access to click handler, I'm going to use the this keyword to get to the click handler. It's mad because it doesn't have a type. I'll give it a type. So I have a click handler there on click. So now I want, when I click it, to see if this is going to run. Let's try it out. Clicked. Let's refresh. And every time I click it, I'm getting a click. Great. So now that I know that that's working, let's replace this with actually changing my state. So I can say if, or not if, but this.set state. And my new state, I want it to be clicks. And I'm going to take the previous state, so this dot state dot clicks, and add 1 to it. It's mad that I'm using it in there, but it's fine. So now we can't actually see it work, so let's just think about instead, let's assume that this is updating properly for now. We might have a little thing we need to figure out later. Now our state is updating. Every time our state updates, it's going to check our view and say, do I need to change? Do I need to change? Do I need to change? Do we actually have anything specifying, though, how we want this view to change based on the clicks in the state? Not right now. So what I want to do is I'm going to use some conditional logic to say, if the number of clicks is less than 10, then I want to show the button. If it's greater than 10, I want to show something else, like, hey, you won, great job. Using a single JavaScript expression, because I can't actually put blocks of JavaScript code. I can only have something that evaluates to a single value. How can I do that? What's a conditional in JavaScript that is not a block? The ternary operator. The ternary operator is the perfect use case for what I want right now. It is going to say, depending on some condition, so let's go ahead and I'll talk it through as we do it. So I'm going to check I'm going to do a JavaScript expression here, and I'm going to check some condition. And for me, it's this.state.clicks is less than 10. So that's my condition. For a ternary, I will first do the success evaluation. And that's the question mark. So I'm going to say if it is truthy, then I want this entire expression to evaluate to something. And if it is falsy, I want it to evaluate to something else. So I can put JSX in both of these positions. So if it is less than 10, I want my button. Let's put it here to make it pretty, like that. So I have my button. And here, I'll just put an H3 and say you won. All right. So now I do have some conditional. So now when my state changes, my view knows how to change. So if I refresh this, that's not good. Is it opposite? What? Thank you. Took me a while to figure out what you all were saying, but I got there in the end. It still seems like my logic's wrong. Can y'all help me with? Oh, yeah, undefined is less than 10. Great. Yay, okay. I can spell. So what is going to happen when I click this button? It's going to, it's going to find the click handler. It's going to run this.click handler. So it's going to run this function. And the this, I am assuming, is going to be the component. However, if I click this, I'm going to get an error that says, cannot read property set state of undefined. For some reason, my this, or not that this here is undefined. Can anyone think of our knowledge of the this object and tell me why? Not this time. Good guess, though. You were so quiet. I'm going to see if someone else who's you know it. Kate's right, yeah. Or Survey.
The DOM should be like, it's taking the DOM. This related to the DOM.
Not quite. it is kind of the button. So you're close. Kate is correct in that here we are giving the definition of click handler to the onClick. How is this function getting invoked? The answer is we don't know. It is getting invoked. It is getting invoked. We are essentially saying, like, onClick, I want to invoke this function, but it is not our code that's invoking it. Therefore, it's not actually getting invoked off of the component. We're expecting some implicit binding to happen that is not happening. So I have a few options. I could make this an arrow function and invoke click handler myself. So now I know exactly how it's being invoked. And it's being invoked off of this object, which I know inside of render will be the component. But I don't really want to depend on me remembering to do that every time. So what you're going to see a lot of people do is I'm going to actually bind click handler to this instance so that it is always going to be this instance. So I'm going to redefine this .click handler inside of my constructor to be this .click handler .bind this. Thankfully, because this is kind of messy, there are some better ways of doing this that are really, really new, like ES8. We can get access to those ways using Babel, but for now I'd like you to just do it this way. So now click handler is always going to have the correct this. It won't be undefined if it gets invoked from the default scope. And I can now refresh, click 10 times, and eventually win the game. I know there's still quite a bit for us to go through with React later today. This is actually almost all of it, though. It can definitely get more complicated, but you now know the basics of React, and you can make a React application. It's just using this and building it up upon itself over and over and over again. So I'm going to give you out a lab that is going to be using similar concepts to what we just went over. Any questions before we start that?
Do you need to memorize what goes inside the webpack?
You do not. You will never be required to create your own Webpack during a checkpoint. During any other project, I'm completely happy if you copy and paste it from somewhere else, as long as you know enough about how it's working to know what you do and don't need, and debug it yourself. I just copy and paste mine from all my projects.
Could you explain again just why you had to add the particular binding? Like, why couldn't you just invoke the like I knew you could, but what was the reason of that?
Because I don't want to have to trust myself to do that. I don't want to have to trust developers coming after me fiddling with my code that they're going to do that. I might use that function multiple places inside of that render, but I don't want to have to make sure that I'm calling it appropriately every time. I just want them to say, like, I know that it's bound, it'll always be bound, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Yeah, as soon as we're done, it's already in your library, in fact, I'll push it straight up. All right, your lab is going to be, I think, called Intro React. I'll find it and send it out to you.